very important to say something about the bipartisan nature of the proposals for constitutional recognition back in those days. When Tony Abbott came to government, he, together with opposition leader Bill Shorten, commissioned a joint select committee to examine the work of the expert panel. Later, Abbott and Shorten met together and worked towards commissioning the Referendum Council under Mark Liebler and Pat Anderson to inquire into what Aboriginal people wanted for constitutional recognition. The terms of reference for the Referendum Council expressly required it to advise both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. The Referendum Council led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart as the culmination of dialogues held with Indigenous people around the country. Following the government's rejection of recommendations of the Referendum Council, Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten again agreed to establish another joint select committee, this time chaired by Pat Dodson and myself. Right the way through, it was a bipartisan process, with government and opposition in lockstep about the process, if not always the outcome. When Pat Dodson and I co-chaired the Parliamentary Committee inquiry into constitutional recognition in 2018, that process again was one of finding common ground. Pat and I sweated every word. We laughed, we argued, we tried to push each other towards our own positions, but we sought to find common ground. That report is the thing I'm most proud of in my time as a parliamentarian. Pat was generous with his knowledge and his time and helped educate me about the world through Indigenous eyes. That report acknowledges that there were many things we and those political constituencies we represented did not agree on, but it focused on what we could agree on. In so many places, we found that despite our differences, that our values aligned, but we had to practically deliver in a way that our various constituencies would embrace. And it wasn't just Pat that I engaged with. I travelled with Linda Burney, with Malarndirri McCarthy, with Warren Snowden. They were all from the other side of politics, but they were generous with their knowledge of Indigenous life and traditions, and I'll always be grateful for that. My life as a parliamentarian with a passion for Indigenous affairs is a constant journey of learning, one that's continued in more recent times, going to Alice Springs with Senator Jacinta Price and in Ceduna with my friend Senator Kerryn Little. That Joint Select Committee recommended a process of co-design for the voice involving Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to develop the local, regional and national elements of the voice. And on the issue of constitutional design, we were presented with 18 different options for constitutional recognition. We didn't resolve that issue, but instead proposed that following the process of co-design, the legal form of the voice, regulatory, legislatively and constitutionally, be addressed. Both the Coalition and Labor committed to a process of co-design at the 2019 election. The re-elected Morrison government appointed a committee under Tom Calma and Marcia Langton to undertake the process of co-design of the local, regional and national bodies. The Calma-Langton report was delivered in July 2021. The report called for a response by the end of that year. And in accordance with the timetable set by Calma-Langton, the Morrison government committed to the rollout of the local and regional bodies in December 2021 and budgeted a $32 million commitment to get the process started. Our plan was to build from the ground up. The plan was for local and regional voices first, as recommended by Calma-Langton. Local and regional voices, then a national voice. The local and regional voices were the foundation, with the insight, the life experience and the moral authority moving up to Canberra rather than down from it. That was the process that was in place until election day last year. Had we been elected in May last year, those bodies would have been well on their way. As well as our commitment to the rollout of local and regional bodies, we reaffirmed our commitment to constitutional recognition, and I quote, "when there's broad agreement on the question and it has the best chance of success." Now, unfortunately, we lost the 2022 election and the way the debate has been conducted has changed. I recognise that the Prime Minister made a referendum on the national voice a signature policy, and he mentioned it at every campaign stop and on election night. There was nothing hidden in what he wanted to do. But the deliberative process of the past decade, engaging in debate, finding common ground, building coalitions, developing careful processes and working across the aisle has been abandoned. It's now top-down. The approach has discarded one of the guiding principles Pat Dodson and I wrote about in our report, namely, and I quote, "balancing the urgency of a voice against the likelihood of a referendum success." We've seen that. The Prime Minister's set the timetable. He's chosen the wording. The Prime Minister first released words at Gama, words not tested or checked with the Attorney-General's Department or the Solicitor-General. He later amended those words in a letter to Peter Dutton, and then he amended again a third time 11 days ago. Along the way, there have been media stumbles by the Prime Minister and ministers because no one has settled the details about how the voice will work. The Prime Minister has chosen this process, or lack thereof. He's chosen not to legislate the body so consensus could be built in the Parliament and Australians could see how his national voice would work. He's chosen not to provide Australians with details. He's chosen not to answer Peter Dutton's questions, which are being asked daily by people around the country. People who share the conviction about the need to see change in the circumstances of Aboriginal people in this country, but who want to know meaningfully what the voice will do and whether it will be meaningful. And he takes offence when questions are asked about details in the Parliament, in media interviews and at press conferences. He has refused to release the Solicitor General's advice, although he was happy to do so last year when it suited his political purposes. And while he's held up the Calma-Langton report in the Parliament, it's clear he's never been across its details. He has ignored repeated calls for a formal government response to Calma-Langton. In doing so, he's shown disrespect to the 9,400 Australians who engaged with that report. He's ignored calls for a process to settle the constitutional amendment before presenting it to Parliament. In doing so, he's ignored the 18 different versions of constitutional amendment presented at the 2018 Joint Select Committee and the discussion of alternatives put forward by such people as Father Frank Brennan and Louise Clegg. And he's ignored the possibility of earlier proposals to reword the racist power and remove the spent race-based provisions in Section 25 of the Constitution. He's failed to establish a process to properly consider the full range of constitutional options and thereby build consensus around a model to be presented to the Australian people. Even now, with his wording going to a parliamentary committee, he has said, and I quote, "I would take a lot of convincing before I would support any amendment to those words." This doesn't sound like the views of a person looking to reach consensus. He says no party has a veto. He says he's prepared to go it alone and occasionally calls for bipartisanship about a process and a timetable which we have had no input into. The Prime Minister abandoned the process of Calma-Langton, a process that was local and regional first and national voice second. The Prime Minister has discarded the deep bipartisan engagement that has characterised at least the last decade. Neither Peter Dutton nor I have had any substantive engagement with the government on how we can achieve consensus. Now, I concede there have been calls and chats before announcements letting us know what's happening. But that's politeness. It's not engagement or partnership. Not answering Australians' questions, not releasing legal advice, not engaging with constitutional issues are not the actions of a government acting in good faith. It's tragic where we find ourselves with an idea that should be bringing us together but isn't, all because of a Prime Minister who knows best and who has abandoned process and the spirit of partnership.